to the RPCs that are helping towns. And I think some of the reporting aspects of the tool that you're going to see today could really help BEM with development of data for the state hazard mitigation plan. So I'm excited to hear what people think about that. And then second, I really want to take my hat off to all of our colleagues at UVM. When we met up on campus, when this project first started, we talked about creating a framework that would allow researchers to immediately apply their science. And it's been a tremendous 3 years of watching that happen, where our colleagues, the faculty and students, the postdocs that have worked on very unique Vermont-based research have been able to plug it directly into this tool. And I think you're going to see a lot of that today. And what I hope is that that really continues in the future, where students can see that opportunity. So thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Before we really dig in, I thought it'd be good to do introductions just to make sure everyone is connected. So maybe we'll start in the room, and Rebecca, maybe we'll just go around.
Sure. Rebecca Pfeiffer, Vermont Rivers Program, State Floodplain Manager, FFI Coordinator.
Hi, Stacy Pomeroy, Rivers Program. I'm sorry, this is my first day back from vacation. My brain is still on there. I should have thought about introductions to start with. Thank you, Roy.
Good. Evan Fitzgerald Environmental, been part of the team developing the FFI tool.
Roy Schiff with SLR Consulting, one of the developers of the tool as well.
Heather Vosion with Agency of Transportation, the green infrastructure engineer there, working on a lot of stormwater and the intersection of our phosphorus control plan, and have also been working pretty involved with the transportation resilience planning tool. So interested to see how these will mesh together.
Good morning, Stephanie Smith. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer at Vermont Emergency Management.
Hi, Steve Libby. I'm happy to be a new member of Stephanie's team here at Vermont Emergency Management.
All right, why don't we hop on?
First half hour of like a big training. It's just introductions the whole time. I don't care.
All right. Uh-oh, someone's unmuted if you're. Yeah, so maybe let's start with, if I can see.
Okay. Alyssa Sabato.
Yep, Alyssa Sabato, Wyndham Regional Commission. I'm a senior planner and I do emergency management and project review here.
Dan Albrecht.
Yeah, Dan Albrecht, Chittenden County RPC. Do some hazard mitigation planning, but my immediate concern is we are the clean water service provider for Basin 5, Northern Lake Champlain. So I need phosphorus reduction projects.
Thank you. Stephanie DePetto?
Stephanie
Sorry.
DePetito. I'm with FEMA Region 1 in the Floodplain Management and Insurance Branch and work closely with Rebecca.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth Doran.
Good morning. I am a research faculty at the University of Vermont working on the habitat component of the FFI. Good to be here.
Thank you. Jason Stick.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Jason Stick. I'm with the Army Corps of Engineers in Baltimore. I found out about the tool through Eileen Shader with American Rivers in the Pennsylvania Silver Jackets team.
Thanks for joining us. Jessica Baldner.
Balerna, maybe?
Sorry.
No worries. Hi, yeah, I'm Jessica Balerna. I am a postdoc at the University of Vermont working with Beverly Wemple on the Cairo project. Thanks for having me.
Great. Jeff Goff. Or John Goff, sorry.
Yeah, hi, John Goff, senior hydrologist, Weather Service in Burlington, mainly deal with warning public safety and also community outreach and flood resiliency and things of that nature. So thanks for inviting me.
I have a person, I'm sorry, your name comes out as M. Gia?
Margot.
Thank you.
This is Margot Gia. I'm a planner at Wyndham Regional Commission, focusing primarily on natural resources, energy, and some hazard mitigation.
Great, glad you could join us. Caroline Paskey.
Hi, Caroline Paskey, State Hazard Mitigation Planner. I'm on Stephanie's team.
Shannon Pitlick.
Hi, I'm Shannon Pitlick. I'm the river scientist for Southern Vermont with DEC.
Stephanie Broke.
Burke. Good morning.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Butcher people's names.
That's all right. I'm a planner with the Rutland Regional Planning Commission, and I support towns in updating local hazard mitigation plans.
Wonderful. Andrea Wright.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Wright. I'm the Environmental Policy Manager at VTrans in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Group that is focusing on climate mitigation and climate adaptation for transportation, and working with Heather on the resilience improvement plan that the agency is putting together, carrying forward efforts on the transportation resilience planning tool that Joe Segali started off with Roy and Evan, and all things resilience for transportation. So I'm happy to be here, but I can only be here for a little while, so I'm just going to drop off, but I'm really interested in hearing more about this tool. Thanks.
Thank you. And I am recording this, and we'll work to get the recording out to folks who may been pop in and out. I think I've got everybody. Speak up if I've missed you. Okay, thank you for the introductions. It's great to have such a nice mix of people here today. Take it away, Roy.
Awesome, thanks. All right, yeah, thanks again for joining. We're excited to share the FFI tool and focus on the resiliency. And I think a couple of you may be joining for the first time or maybe a second time. And if you are interested in the water quality aspects, there are videos that are going to get posted on the website. Stacy's working on that now, so you can get a little more detail on the water quality aspects, and obviously you can get this video. So let's get started. Here's the agenda for the day. We got a few hours. It's pretty packed, and the reason is we're going to try to give the framework for FFI, talk about the connectivity methods, and then really dig into the resiliency methods. It's going to be a little more slide driven and talking about the background until the break. And then Evan and I are going to take turns really working on the application, and you can follow along during item number 6 there after the break, working with the web tool. And then, we'll dig into a couple case studies to wrap the day up. Plan for the day. If you have questions, I mean, the group's small enough. I think you should just online raise your hand so we know, and in the room, just blurt them out. And let's keep this informal and so everybody's on the same page. As we get started, just want to acknowledge Mike started with UVM. There's a lot of great partners on this project. Evan and I are representing a big crew. Several couldn't be here today. So just want to start out by thanking everyone here, including people at VEM, and folks have put a lot of time into all the resiliency work that we drew from in this project. A lot of the empirical data that we made relationships out of our projects funded by VEM and DC and others. So it's a pretty awesome project to bring all this together. All right, so let's give a little context. You all know of the manipulation that's gone on in rivers. Our state's had a long legacy of assessing rivers and understanding how they've been altered. And really what the alterations come down to are disconnection of our rivers as people lived around them, put infrastructure around them, harness them for power, try to avoid flooding. It really became disconnection both laterally and vertically, and longitudinally up and down the river with dams and whatnot, and then temporally in the bottom right. Here you can see what happens when you install flood control dams. You lose the pulsing of the system, and this changes how things move through a system, including water quality. And as you lose floodplains, we know that things get more
The room was just muted.
Okay, Yep, sorry.
And can everybody hear me now? Okay, great. Thanks for the nods. And so those disconnections really translate on the left to water quality, enhanced export as rivers get disconnected from their floodplains. Maybe what we're all more focused on today is also with stuff in the way in floodplains, we get a lot of damages. And we saw a lot of this really play out in notorious ways during Irene, but this happens all over the state. You all know from ongoing flood damage. And, this happens at different scales. We think a lot about, we've seen a lot of pictures of going back, Route 4 and Menden Brook and major disruptions. But here's a small bridge and playing field where enough floodplain's been disconnected in a system that's in a narrow valley and disruptions to debris transport. So, an ongoing project to put in a bridge that fits a stream channel, but also try to improve transport. And a lot of this really stems from disconnection in the floodplains. Another example or two, this is a project ongoing in the area of William Street in Brattleboro. There's going to be a big floodplain reconnection project there that's going to help with some flood storage. Again, develop floodplains, some historic filling in floodplains. And then on the right, you can see that, we are forcing rivers to kind of do things they don't often do. And this is really disrupting the longitudinal and temporal connectivity. And this is Roaring Brook in Killington, where the brook comes out along Route 4 and is asked to make a hard river left turn into an alluvial fan. And you can see after Irene that the fan was reformed, maybe in a lower area. This whole area is an alluvial fan. And so it really comes back to the connectivity of these rivers, and they create hazards and they play out at, over a range of storms. So really FFI is going to try to, some of the research we're using to sort of start understanding resiliency and what that risk reduction might look like. And that's kind of the goal of today. Taking a step back, to understand FFI, you kind of need to know a little bit about the TMDL. It's a very unique TMDL for Lake Champlain. And it includes a component, a sector that's linked to river instability, 20% of the pie. And this is based on phosphorus loading, but nonetheless, the framework of this is really how we get to resiliency, and you'll see it as we talk today. So, phosphorus export happens from the landscape, and some monitoring and previous studies suggest that 20% of that comes from the unstable river channels, and a lot of that stems from disconnection from floodplains. So it's a unique TMDL in that we will continue our policies of working towards the least erosive geomorphic condition, allowing channel evolution to play out. And so the channel erosion practice, it says it's not a conventional site scale BMP. And the idea is, and we'll talk a lot about this today, that if you harden streams in the river corridor, you're not getting a credit for those from a phosphorus perspective. And this might put a nuance in some of our work we do to keep people safe around rivers and to reduce flood hazards. And we're doing this now. We're focusing on the river corridor. We're looking at corridor plans. We're finding out, well, where are these projects where we don't lock a stream out of equilibrium? And that's baked into our stream alteration permitting process. And so it has both a water quality benefit, clearly a resiliency benefit for our stabilization projects, and then as well a habitat benefit if we honor this principle. So the context here is that when our loading from the channel stability sector is really linked to allowing this channel evolution state model on the left-hand side of the screen to play out, right? So moving through a stable setting with connected floodplains, through an incision and winding process, and then having reconnected floodplains. If you think about what we do on the landscape in terms of floodplain reconnection projects, when we put a corridor protection, a river corridor protection easement on an area, we allow this process to play out, or we preserve a floodplain connection. When we go out and lower a floodplain, we're really pushing a channel towards stage 5 of that evolution process. So in the TMDL, and this probably is a little less relevant for this training, but there are segments of the lake that have phosphorus reduction targets. And what we've done is we've transferred those up into the TMDL subbasins. They're analogous to Huck 12 watersheds. They're similar. And that's kind of what you see on this map. And then you'd get some crediting for that. What's more important for this group is that crediting is linked to floodplain connectivity. So Evan's going to dig deep into the departure analysis because it's not only the basis for how we provide P credits, but it's the basis for how we offer credits or potential risk reduction in dollar amounts for resiliency. And it's going to be the basis for Liz, her team, and some of us, Mike and I, to develop the habitat methods based on that connectivity. Because we know that when floodplains are connected to their channels, the habitat formation and fish passage is all better, that the ecosystem can thrive.
On the last slide, you said that they correspond to some extent to the stage of evolution. Is that?
Well, I think. So, good.
I just wondered, like, in that legend,
yeah,
if those match up to the various stages.
Yeah, so
a little more complicated than that.
Maybe a little more complicated, but okay. I would say that so we've done river assessments. We know how connected those floodplains are, and then there were allocations made and then distributed out through the watershed.
Okay.
So to receive some sort of credit for a project, you would have to do a reconnection that sort of honors the evolution stages on the left and not disrupts that. That's kind of the point.
Okay. So
does that make sense?
Yeah. So the legend is a little bit more like for that sub watershed, there's a average amount of disconnection happening.
That's right. And so this was done on a larger scale, and we've kind of projected that into these smaller, these Huck 12 watersheds. And the color coding says, what is that phosphorus base load allocation projected into the whole Lake Champlain Basin? So this was maybe a first step at taking the lake segment reduction or P allocations and reduction targets and like projecting them up into the Lake Champlain Basin watershed to give us a framework for crediting against water quality.
And this data came to us from the state. Like these allocations were made by the state as part of the TMDL to each of these Huck 12s, and we kind of ran with them with the crediting.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So from a water quality perspective, you get credit for two things. One is you do a project that improves stream stability, and that's through reconnection. And two is you create storage. You're going to see a little bit about this as we play around with the web application. Again, if you want to really dig deep into this, there's a several hour training that's going to be a video, but we'll focus on resiliency. And so this is important. So how do you know if your project is eligible for a credit? A new gain toward equilibrium that's not impede channel evolution or attainment of equilibrium in order to get and it says load reduction credit, but you can put any credit on that, right? And the more you impede on this, the less your potential crediting is going to be. And then at the same time, the target is to reconnect your floodplains, protect those through land protection such as river corridor easements over the long term, naturally vegetate the 50-foot buffer or wider. And then you can also credit post 2010 when the TMDL was implemented. And again, that's maybe a little less relevant for this, but I think it's important to understand what the vision of that is, because when we do our resiliency projects, we can actually impede on this natural vision, which would eliminate the potential for other credits going along. And so when we do a water quality project or a resiliency project, or a habitat project, ideally these co-benefits go together. Even if it's around the transportation system, we can get crediting for that. And this is a graphic that I believe Stacy, Shannon.
Mike put it.
Mike.
It was combined effort.
Combined effort out of DC. And what you see here is the river corridor. And you can see that this project is showing how a berm removal is taking place. And then at the same time, you have bank armoring inside the meander belt, the piece of the river corridor where the river is likely to meander over the long term. Then you have a buffer. So the idea is you'd get some crediting from a phosphorus perspective for the berm removal because you're reconnecting the floodplain, and for the buffering, but the bank armoring piece inside that corridor you would not get credit for. This could be what a resiliency project looks like if there's a house there and that's on the edge of the corridor. You get some water quality benefit, and then you can claim some risk reduction benefit there. Ideally, this red line, lands outside of that meander belt, and then you can kind of realize like the river's going to move around and allow those other co-benefits to play out. And just on an aside, I've been doing some project work recently around riprap and historic riprap, and we kind of are seeing like a 10 to 20 year lifespan on armored banks before they have to be maintained in pretty steep and high power settings, like on the New Haven River and along some roads. So there are nudges you can do to like make that longer, make it shorter, but this riprap is like a temporary thing, something we have to deal with and maintain over the long term. Just a side note. So where does FFI apply? Right now it applies to the Lake Champlain Basin. This map's a little busy, but it's the blue outline we're all mostly familiar with. Note there is a TMDL for phosphorus for the Lake Memphremagog Basin, and there's been some discussion with the state that perhaps FFI would be extended there. Probably a pretty quick lift. Methodology would be pretty much the same. Then there's been some discussion about the Connecticut Basin. The methods would have to be not the floodplain connectivity methods, but on the nutrient side, methods would have to be changed because nitrogen becomes more of an issue in the Connecticut Basin. The TMDL, Long Island Sound, its receiving water is a nitrogen TMDL. So probably some change in methodologies. And then we haven't, at least, I don't know, we haven't really talked about the Hudson drainage area and down there. So right now our focus is the Champlain Basin. And these are the projects. I think most of the people in this group have done some form of these natural resource projects that we're thinking about in terms of reconnecting floodplains. You can see in the upper left the existing conditions, and then B would be reconnecting a flood chute. State funded a project in Ripton, Vermont. Middlebury River was another big hazard mitigation project where flood chutes are reconnected. And these are like safety relief valves for when flooding happens. The nice thing about these is they're out there. A lot of the work happens outside of a flowing river. Berm removal. We did an assessment on cost effectiveness on the phosphorus side, and we found that berm removal is probably the most cost effective way to get phosphorus credits. We're not going to dig deep into that information, and there's also, if you think about a berm, it often has the most bang for your buck per dollar spent on floodplain reconnection because it's a smaller feature that runs right through a floodplain. Then we have flood benching, which is essentially a smaller floodplain removal. And then floodplain lowering, we're seeing this happen in more places. These get pretty expensive because it's a lot of material often that's been historically filled in floodplains, or if the river cut down, there's a lot of material removed. And then we have vegetative buffer. So this is a schematic made by UVM on some of the natural resource projects. A piece of the context is Vermont's been, in my view, leading the way on floodplain reconnection. We had this great geomorphic data set. It moved to river corridor planning. Our state has always been looking at risk reduction. When I first learned about the rivers program, there was always like a three-prong approach, and it was habitat, like public safety and resiliency and water quality. And that really led to a lot of these floodplain restoration projects. And FFI is really a way to sort of almost make a systematic tool to like find these projects and credit them in different bins, one of being the TMDL and this being the resiliency. So this is the Black Creek floodplain reconnection. I believe this spot was in Fletcher, Bakersfield area, where you basically lowered a berm and reconnected a floodplain. And now the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail goes through the area. All this information is housed on a web application. We're going to play around with it after the break. I do want to credit Stone Environmental that actually built the physical web application. Evan, myself, Mike, Kristen Underwood, and others really worked on the methodology development, and they really, I think, did a nice job to kind of smashing this all together into a web application. And in that, you can start to look at connectivity. So Evan's going to give us a walk through that after the break. And then, one thing I wanted to say is that, FFI, as we've started using the tool more and more and made refinements, FFI is something you're going to revisit as a project gets developed. So you might use FFI to do some initial planning and project development, think about it during alternatives analysis, but you might keep coming back to it as you learn more about a project through the design and evaluation process. The size of a project might shape some of the parameters, and reconnections as you develop a project just might expand. And so whether you're looking for a phosphorus credit or a resiliency credit or a habitat credit, you'll probably be coming back a few times to the tool. And once you get comfortable using it, it's really quick to just put in the information, and get some predictions of what you're crediting and what your benefits might be in the project. Everything we're going to talk about today, and probably even more, is in the user guide. We're working on a revision. We're about to wrap up this phase of the FFI. This is our last training at the end of the month. So this user guide's getting an overhaul. All the details, the nitty-gritty details and background that we're going to talk about today are in the appendices, so you can dig deep into them on all the phases of FFI. So with that, I'm going to take a quick pause, see if anyone has questions on sort of the context and background. And Evan's going to move into the connectivity methods that really drive every benefit, in the FFI application. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, I'll switch with you. Yeah, I'll let you take over and drive.
All right, so for the next little bit, I'm going to go through the connectivity methods. I want to just credit, since Mike Klein is here, credit Mike, because a lot of this framework and ideas really came from him from his days at DEC. And it was in response to the need to develop a framework to credit phosphorus load through the TMDL in the stream sector. So I think it's fair to say that these methods were originally developed, with the TMDL in mind. But of course, based on Roy's introduction, connectivity is really underpins resiliency as well. And so in the tool, we've adapted the connectivity methods to inform flood hazard mitigation benefits that you get from these different projects. So connectivity, when we talk about it, you're going to hear us talk about floodplain connectivity and stream connectivity. Floodplain connectivity encompasses lateral and vertical components, and stream connectivity longitudinal and temporal. And here's just a kind of a simple graphic to illustrate what our target condition is for connectivity. An ideal connected river is fully connected laterally and vertically, has robust protections on the landscape, including easements or other protections that I'll describe in a bit, and has a healthy woody vegetated buffer. Those are the three components. We measure connectivity at different scales, and the number you can keep in mind is 2. 2 square miles separates what we call the lower valley reaches from the headwaters, and that may be familiar to some of you. The river corridors that are drawn at the statewide scale from DEC, those start at the 2 square mile drainage, go downstream, and the headwaters would be upslope from that. The other number 2 to keep in mind is 2%. So we're separating high gradient and low gradient streams based on that 2% threshold. So the units at which we measure connectivity are the corridors and the stream reaches. Over on the left-hand side here, you can see the corridors in the dash, black and white. And as part of the corridor drawing process, we learned partway through this project that there were subunits within the corridor that we learned we really liked because they're at a scale that seems to pick up on differences in connectivity and kind of patterns on the landscape. They're actually hydrologic divisions. So anywhere where a tributary comes in to the corridor, it makes a new subunit, even if the bigger river corridor unit encompasses a reach. So that's what we see here on this graphic. And we have a naming convention that I won't get into too much because we'll be looking at that in the tool. Over on the right here, these are the floodplains that University of Vermont developed as part of some research. And we took those subunit divisions from the river corridor process and overlaid those on the floodplains and sort of chunked those up for the purpose of connectivity measurements in this tool. All right, so now I want to walk you through the actual connectivity methods. Remember I mentioned lateral connectivity and vertical connectivity, protections, and buffers. This first slide illustrates the lateral meander connectivity. And this is an image of the lower village of Waitsfield. What you can see in the image here is basically everything within this subunit of the corridor, highlighted yellow, is free of what we call hard constraints. So that would be buildings, bridges, roads. Whereas a portion of the corridor here along Route 100 has constraints that won't allow the river to utilize the full meander profile. So even when we account for this area that's lost, there's about 70% of this subunit that remains what we call connected or lacking hard constraints. Protections are an area weighted factor of different basically overlays on the landscape that we get from mapping. So the highest level of protection would be a river corridor easement that protects the corridor in perpetuity, allows the river to establish its full pattern and profile. Other protections, floodplain protections and state lands perhaps, and things like this, we consider a lower level of protection. We do an overlay in GIS, consider all of those different levels of protection and have this kind of dimensionless rating that we translate into high, moderate, limited, or mostly absent. The woody buffers are probably the simplest. This is basically what area of that 50-foot setback from the top of the bank is naturally vegetated in a woody buffer, and we're measuring that with, I'll answer your question in a second, Dan. We're measuring that with the land cover mapping from the Spatial Analysis Lab from UVM. And important to note, we're considering wetland areas as well, where the natural state may not be a full-grown forest, but rather a shrubby, scrubby, setting. That's also a natural, riparian area that we consider. So Dan, I think your question was the definition of an easement. Is that, I didn't.
Well, I know the legal definition, but I'm trying to understand why a municipal river corridor floodplain is a 0.5, but an easement is considered better.
Yeah. Well, an easement is arguably the highest level of protection because it protects the land from anything happening in perpetuity, really. Whereas the flood hazard corridor bylaws, I'd say, have some allowances for infill development and other things. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
Well, and
yeah, okay,
Yep.
that's what I was thinking. That's what I was thinking it was. So you answered my question.
That, and I think that, there's always the chance at a time we decide it's not for them, like in Brattleboro.
Yep.
So.
I was surprised. I'm glad you said something, Dan, because I was like, oh, we snuck through that FEMA floodway. God, it was in the moderate category. There was a lot of debate about some of these.
Yeah.
And I think the thought was that if there was a potential for someone to like control a river and do a disconnection project, it could be like a little thing like a small berm or a little armor. And those happened all over these, all over floodways. So that said, unless we're sure we're going to bump it down a little bit and create the potential for a project, a reconnection project. I think that was our thinking.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think. Flood hazard bylaws don't prevent armoring per se, stream alterations, permits from being issued to stop migration.
I think like wetlands and floodways were in a one, and we said, we got a couple people brought this up and we're like, yeah, we agree, we should probably bump those down. I don't know, I think they might.
Because it's looking at it, it's looking at something different than, like a FEMA floodway is looking at conveyance of water. And that's it. It's purely looking at how quickly can we pass water somewhere else. It's almost the opposite of.
Thanks, Dan. Yep. Okay, so then we bring, I'm just going to keep zooming along here because we got a fair amount to cover. We bring these three criteria together. You can see the weighting up here in the upper left, 50% for lateral meander connectivity, 35% for the protections, 15% for the buffer. That's 100%. Now we bring in, so that this is lateral connectivity. And now we bring in the vertical component. So what this map is showing, zooming out in the Mad River Valley, you see a lot of green. And that's because laterally, the Mad River Valley is actually pretty free of constraints if you ignore agricultural constraints to start. But the river is very incised through the Mad River Valley. So now we bring in a weighting of 1-to-1, lateral connectivity, vertical connectivity, because really you need equal parts both to have a connected river. And when we do that and consider the incision ratio, we see in the Mad River Valley in particular, and a lot of our lower valley reaches that are incised, we bring those together 1-to-1 and we have a pretty low connectivity rating, even if laterally we're free of constraints. So stream connectivity is made up of the longitudinal and temporal components, 60% and 40%. Here we're talking about longitudinally barriers to the movement of water, sediment, debris, and ice downstream and aquatic organisms upstream. And temporal connectivity, we're thinking about that timing and magnitude of flow, including even low flows. So a good example of a human infrastructure that disrupts both would be a big flood control dam. Affects obviously how water and sediment debris moves downstream, prevents AOP upstream. So we start with, for both longitudinal and temporal, we start with a score of 100, pretty simple scoring, and then we deduct based on the magnitude of that disruption along the longitudinally along the network. We do consider incision as well because incised reaches will disrupt the sediment regime and sort of the balance of sediment moving down valley. And for temporal connectivity, we're considering changes on the landscape, urbanization, roads, agriculture that affect runoff patterns. And again, incision as well, which affects the connectivity of the floodplain and sort of storage of floodwaters in particular during a big flood. Same construct, we start with a score of 100 and we deduct based on the sort of the scale of that manipulation. So then bringing all this back to the phosphorus loading. I know we're focused on resiliency today, but if you get into this tool, invariably you're going to want to understand the phosphorus crediting. So remember Roy showed that image of the different allocations by HUC 12 for phosphorus. We distribute that phosphorus load down to the those different units, the subunits and the reaches based on this allocation tree that you see here. So we're basically weighting the lower valley reaches higher than the headwaters and differently based on the gradient. I won't go through this whole thing, but At the end of the day, these percentages that you see at the end of the tree are what we allocate to the different bins of stream types and corridor types. And those bins are what we can credit against in the TMDL when we do connectivity projects. I think that is it for my piece.
Yeah, maybe Evan, go back one second. I mean, the other important thing here is, so this departure analysis lets us know if you go to a watershed or a subunit, like how connected or disconnected it is. So no matter what your view, no matter what benefit you're interested in, habitat, resiliency, water quality, if you can say, oh, this subunit is 100% connected, this river reach is 100% connected up and downstream, then you know you're going to have the most benefit. Whereas you can simply go to the web and say, these are very disconnected. That's where I'm going to get, if I do a project there, that's where I'm going to get a benefit. So this is really the connectivity methods Evan just described are really the basis for everything in FFI in that stream channel, stability sector.
A couple of slides before that, talking about the stream connectivity and the scores. Are you looking to have, I mean, what's the goal is to have a 0? Is that right? Did you start at 100 and you're trying to get to 0? Is that?
Oh, no, 0 would indicate the lowest level of connectivity.
Okay.
So, yeah, sorry. So 100 is the highest level of connectivity. That means there are no constraints to the movement of materials, water, downstream and upstream.
This slide is about the departure. So you have a score of 100 if you don't have any constraints to longitudinal connectivity. But I put, let's take a realistic case for Vermont. I have a small intact run-of-river dam on that reach only, and my score is 100. So small intact ROR run-of-river dam -30, so my score would be 70 there. So when I click on that reach, I know that there's a dam there that is breaking up the longitudinal and temporal connectivity, and I would take that dam out, I'd get a +30 score back, and I'd get to that 100% connectivity.
That would correspond to a phosphorus credit associated with that departure.
And a resiliency benefit, which we'll talk about next.
So these are actually like positives that you would add back to your score?
Yeah, we just happen to show the deductions, like it's really about the departure from that perfect level of connectivity. Is this how the whole thing's set up?
Okay.
And it's all based on 100 and like high, medium, low kind
I think I got it now.
Yeah, I think it was the
So like that
negative.
first one is a 10 out of 100 in its current condition.
That's right. If you have a large flood control dam, like on Wrightsville, on North Branch, Winooski, you're going to get, your score for longitudinal is going to be a 10. And we're going to live with a lot of 10s because there are these dams around our state that protect a big population.
Yeah, we're not interested in getting to 100 there and removing that.
Probably not going to. So that's why the North Branch, Winooski is going to have some habitat and water quality issues in perpetuity because of its disconnection.
It's a good comment. It's funny when you make these slides and you go through them so many times, you don't realize this should not say remove corresponds to -90. It actually is indicating a large flood controlled dam deducts 90. If you removed it, you add 90. So
Okay.
we could verify this table a lot better now that you put that out.
Take a question, just talk.
Yeah, it was just, it was asking if the tool shows connectivity for the full state or just the Champlain Basin. So right now it's just for the Champlain Basin.
Okay. All right, good questions. So let's hop into the resiliency methods. Let's see, we got till 10:30, so 40-ish minutes. We'll see where we land here. So this is a mock-up of the resiliency approach. So we put in our connectivity data, we hit calculate, and we were asking the question like, what do we want to know to start? And the answer was, we want to know what's at risk in our connectivity areas. So in the river corridors and in the floodplains, Evan showed, and we're going to dig a little deeper into those. How much value is in there? Because that's really what risk is, right? It's about stuff in the way. Like if it's a forest land, maybe there's no risk. And if it's a farmland, there's some cost to ag land. And then if it's downtown Waterbury, then there's a much higher risk. And so we did an analysis that you're going to see where we estimated the cost of all the private property and infrastructure in the corridors and floodplains. And we set those in risk bins. Then we said, well, if we do a reconnection project, what's that potential benefit? And so we went back to we harvested all the databases and looked back at all of our projects. And we said, this is what the risk reduction looks like a percent of that value is protected. We drew on some FEMA information, and we'll talk about this now. So, and this is a early mock-up of a floodplain restoration project that Evan was working on, and he and his colleague Evelyn put this together. So it shows you the values, and then for erosion and inundation, erosion being in the river corridor, inundation in the floodplain, and what those potential reductions are. Wanted to just dig deep. Mike talked about the research, and that's really been, for me, one of the coolest parts of this, beyond this team of people to work with, like getting research like as it's happening into like something that's going to affect policy is pretty cool. And I think what I'm seeing is like the floodplain research, which includes a pretty cool thread of resiliency information, like with Carrie Watson's work about the Middlebury River and all that. Like, there's a whole line of research at UVM that's going to really help us. And there's not a lot of information out there on like how, when you change floodplains, like what happens to the water quality and what happens to the habitat and to public, safety. So we're lucky to have that going on. And I think it's going to continue, and I think it will find its way into FFI, but we have the methods to start. So this is so one of the issues was we didn't have floodplains, so we needed all around the basin. And so Rebecca Deal and Kristen and others created this methodology to create floodplains. You can get these on VCGI now. And this is kind of a game changer for someone thinking about planning for risk and even doing a projects where we do a lot of projects in rural areas that are reconnected floodplains, and we don't really know where they are. So this is the basis of that floodplain mapping. And so we use this estimated 500-year floodplain limit and said, every building, every house, every road, and we put a value on that. And so now we have that chopped up all around the Champlain Basin. It's pretty valuable for when you're thinking about a project. And then what we did was we kind of did some categorization. And so this is the value of that inundation risk summary again on the floodplain side, and the erosion risk that happens mostly in the corridor. We wanted those separately. So this is low on the left side, the tall plots, high on the right side. And, these are the dollar values. So if you had $1 million or more value in that corridor floodplain, we said, we're going to put you in the high category, and $100,000 and less. And we looked at the whole distribution, and this is kind of where we landed. And one thing you see is like, we live in a pretty rural state, but we have pockets of development that are pretty intense. And so that's kind of why you almost see two peaks, on the outside. One of our peaks, is pretty big on the rural side. So that's our value. And just to again, this will all be in the user guide, but, we had to make some pretty wild assumptions, like, culverts and bridges vary in cost, but we went back to a whole list of projects, harvested some databases, talked with folks, and these are kind of the where we landed on some of the infrastructure values. Talked to structural engineers. These things are varying pretty wildly. We also looked at the cost of a road reconstruction per mile, pulling on some IRENE data and some current project data. Then we looked at buildings, we took the E911 points and came up with rough costs for all sorts of buildings, sewage treatment plants, pretty fun exercise. A lot of professional judgment and then some empirical data and some real estate data and all that kind of went into this. So in the end, we put values on that. Evan, chime in because you guys made these plots. This is for erosion, number of river corridors, so thousands of river corridor subunits. And then here's the values of, you know, the low hazard, the less than 100,000. And on the right side, I'm pointing, I should be using this thing, on the right side, over 1 million. And we broke this out by our zones in FFI. Lower Valley, that's the greater than 2 square mile watersheds. And then Evan mentioned less than 2 square miles. We actually did a little work, which I'm not going to touch on, but just know that we actually delineated upstream headwater, river corridors and floodplains and assigned those. So like you have low gradient, less than 2%, high gradient, greater than 2%. So you can kind of see the breakdown of the value by watershed position in this plot in the high, medium, and low categories of where the erosion hazards are. What you see is you see a lot in the lower valleys. It's function of there's a lot of area there, and then when you get into the lower valleys, some of your erosion hazards drop, but you still kind of see them in some of these categories.
Just going to say an excellent example. We'll go over this later with a run through the app, but right where we sit today on the Winooski, there's a lot of infrastructure in this corridor, and we're in one of the lower valley reaches where there's over $1 million of infrastructure.
We also broke that out by planning basin. This is really set up. This whole thing is really set up in a watershed framework. So the Vermont planning basins are the Champlain Basin, Vermont planning basins, and then you go through your HUC system and down all the way down to your subunits and reaches. And so this shows you kind of the same breakdown, but rather than split it by your location in each watershed, it's split out by basins. You can filter all this stuff and create reports in FFI, and we're probably not going to get deep into the watershed reporting, but just know, like, if you wanted to just start tracking, stuff down in the corridor in the Winooski, you can do that through FFI, or if you wanted to do it in the Mad River Basin, in Mad River subwatershed, you can do that and sort of track these values. This is the inundation risk. And so this really should say number of floodplains because it's the broader floodplain context for inundation. Again, you kind of see the lower valley, the lower risk here, and then the higher on the right side. And again, same thing by basin. So these will be in the user guide. And so we looked at some values of how do we know if you have flooding, how do we do damage reductions if we do a project that lowers the flood levels? And what we found was this is out of the HAZUS, which is a hazard evaluation tool for FEMA. It's kind of like a census block scale version of the BCA. You often do that at like one parcel base, and this is to do it. And we've done a little work with HAZUS on census level tracks, and this plot really shows that when you knock the water surface down 1 foot, you reduce your damages by about 4% of that building value. There's a couple outliers on this plot, but that's the relationship that HAZUS uses in its modeling. So every foot of water, additional flooding in a building creates more and more damages. You cross some thresholds when you get to above into a first living floor, into a second floor, and so on. But this is a general trend that we use. There's actually a little bit of there's some pretty big economic ramifications. This is a little bit of an aside, but talking about floodplains and value, that a bunch of years back, and I think many people in this room know, FEMA realized that the natural functioning floodplains really are a way to drive risk down. And so now when you do BCA, you get credits for that. And you get, a substantial credit of nearly $37,000 per acre per year, which really has made a lot of infrastructure work viable in the state of Vermont. So I think many people know about this, but when this policy came out many years ago, it was pretty fresh. And then the policy was amended several years back that there was a threshold BCR, meaning you had to have, your project had to be 3/4, the benefits had to be at least 3/4 of the cost to be able to use this environmental benefit. Now that's not the case. You can just kind of use those benefits. So we're kind of using this theory and some of the damage curves to say, well, if I knock a flood level by doing a floodplain reconnection project down a foot, what sort of cost savings could I expect? We also built on this and did some evaluation in Waterbury, and this shows that for a variety of floodplain mitigation options, such as elevating or increasing the height of utilities. And when you restored a 40-acre floodplain in Vermont, in Waterbury, it shows that you'd get a $10,000 benefit per year by doing a floodplain restoration project. And that's an annualized value of knocking those benefits down when you have a big flood. This was about a 20% savings. So the hazardous documentation might be a little more conservative in that 4% savings. This is kind of the range we've seen. The economic benefits of floodplains kind of range from about 5% to 20% of the value of your product. We stuck with the low value to be conservative.
What did you assume for the restoration? What did that?
So like we'll get into that, but like the floodplain reconnection project. So, and meaning like, what does the restoration project do to? Yeah. So that's what this shows.
Okay.
So no, it's right on cue. So we found that harvesting data, and then we took all the modeling we had for floodplain reconnection projects and found that you typically saw 1/2 to 3 feet of flood lowering when you reconnected these projects. And a lot of that is a function of the size of the project. If you are in a spot where you get a big floodplain reconnection, like relative to the size of the floods, then you get a more lowering. And we found that the average was about 2 feet of floodplain lowering. And so you can see, I'm not going to dig too deep. This table again will be in the user guide, but there's a whole list of what those flood lowerings were and what slopes of the channels were, and some other drainage information and whatnot to kind of help us understand, like parse this apart. So in the end, we kind of said 2 feet's about the average, 4% reduction. And we also did that on the erosion side. This is a stream power reduction. Stream power is the ability for the river channel to do work and do erosion. And what we saw was a wider range of about 7 to 2,000 watts per meter square reduction.
Just lost audio.
Looks like the room might have dropped, but the screen's still being shared.
Going on and
Yeah,
off.
I've been losing audio. Well, it's kind of weird. They've been dropping in and out.
Okay, I wonder.
The light went off. It's back on now. Can you hear us now?
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe maybe I should talk a little closer to the mic.
Maybe there's like a.
Yeah, I don't know if I can pull this out.
Flicker.
Okay.
Yeah, like a.
All right.
Flicker.
Like a.
All right, we'll keep going. Yeah, just give us a quick note if you can't hear us again. And so we created a scaling system to know that some projects you kind of would get that full benefit. And then some projects are inherently a little less productive in terms of, again, we used a little bit of empirical, like if you're reconnecting a flood chute, you tend not to drop the water levels as much as if you're restoring a whole floodplain. So the modeling, the few models we had showed about 1/3 of that flood water reduction. So we translated that to like 1/3 of the risk reduction and so on. Same thing with the buffers. And we kind of have a whole scaling set up for the inundation values as well. When you replace bridges, you tend to get, some, more benefits. And then when you versus the culverts. So we kind of, again, use the modeling we had and scale those potential benefits. And that really led us to this table, and this is for inundation. And what it shows is that the size of a project drives the level of risk reduction. And this shows that if I do a floodplain reconnection on the smaller side, I'm going to get a 10% reduction in the stuff that's in the 10% or 10-year floodplain. And then I'm going to get a 5% reduction out to the 25 and 50-year floodplain. And I'm not going to get any reduction in big floodplain for a small project. And again, this is all sort of based on empirical models. If you do a moderate size 1 to 5 acre reconnection project, those values increase. And then if you do a really big project, like you're reconnecting, many acres of floodplain, you get, a higher level of reduction. And that's all scaled from the modeling we had. At the same time, the question was asked early on, well, how far up and downstream do you get these benefits? So we used our modeling and looked in the literature. Smaller projects, the benefits tend to be more localized. As a project gets larger, and again, this is all for inundation, you tend to move up and downstream. The average length of a subunit is about 1,000 feet to 1,600 feet was the actual average number, but it can be quite variable. It's, as Evan said, it's sort of hydrologically based. Some of them are smaller and some of them are wider. And we had to come up with a consistent methodology. So what we did was we said, if you're putting in a 1 to 5 acre floodplain, you get your benefit on the subunit you're working on, as well as 1 up and 1 downstream. And for inundation, we found that if you're working on a greater than 5 acre floodplain, you get a little more benefit beyond that as the project lowers the flood levels and you sort of have a slight depression, kind of a couple thousands of feet away from the project. All right. And so we set this up, and then we kind of broke it apart for buildings as well as infrastructure based on some of the damage records we had and the past flooding patterns we've saw. So this is all summarized in those UVM derived floodplains. We excluded bridges for inundation. It includes culverts because they tend to not influence inundation as much. They tend to be bigger structures based on how they were designed. And we said lower valley channels with greater two slope have no inundation risk reduction applied. Again, that's based. So basically, again, we tally everything in the floodplain, take a % reduction, and then display that. We also did that. We had to do a little more approximating for the headwater streams because we didn't really have as much information. So what we did was we used kind of the slopes and looked at some flood profiles and typical flood lowering and kind of came up with a way to scale the reductions in the headwaters. Just so you know, the headwater aspect of this probably needs a little more work. It was going to be sort of a black box. All the headwaters in a major basin were going to be the same, but Mike and others, we all just weren't satisfied with that. So we started to create a structure for the FFI, but it kind of needs a little more work. That's probably a future work. But what we've done is we've approximated a same method and approach. So you can do a project in the headwaters and get a credit for it in any of the kind of benefit areas you're looking at. But there's still some work to do there. Then we have an erosion hazard screen. So that's the inundation side. So water fills up, you have inundation hazards, water goes away. And this is really on the power side. Like, how do you change the erosion characteristics when you do a project? So now we're focused on the river corridor where the river's meandering. Are you dropping down the potential for avulsions? Are you reducing bank erosion? And that's really what the erosion side is. And first, what we did was we did an initial stratification by sediment regime type. And this really built on some work Kristen Underwood led at UVM and others and her team. And Mike did a little work on this. And it really comes out of the River Corridor Planning Guide. And there are sediment transport streams that are inherently less dangerous and more dangerous, right? And you have, and I'm not great on the sediment transport until I see a guide, but you have certain stream types, for example, like that are transport dominated that tend to be less risk. And then you have confined source and transport. So these are streams that are like prone to, coarse sediment deposition areas, and those tend to be really prone to wild adjustments, and they're riskier. And then you have kind of like fine sediment, coarse deposition. So these are kind of somewhere in the middle, and you kind of have this range. And so with the river corridor planning, we had this in some areas, but Kristen, as part of her research associated with this, made an algorithm to use some of this data and other remote sensing data to map the whole Champlain Basin. So that's our first level of classification. Then we did our empirical analysis again, focused on the changes in stream power and the size and the size of the project to lump into different groups. Again, similar concepts, and notice that, maybe I'll go back. So some of these scales are, you go 10%, 20%, and here you're going up to 50%, right? Erosion damages tend to be more costly. You tend to lose your property or the building is destroyed rather than inundated, repaired. So the scale of recovery is a little different from erosion hazards. So again, we have the sediment regime types. Then what we do is we look at the potential for reductions, again, up and downstream, a little bit of a different pattern with the erosions based on the modeling. And then finally, we have these warning indicators. So if you land in a certain class, in a certain category, we look at the stream power modeling. Excuse me. And again, this was research done by UVM to build on some of the past stream power work that's all over the Champlain Basin. So we have modeling and now we have stream power, and I'll show you that in a second. And then we have other warning indicators, like if you're at confluence areas, there's a lot of crossings, and if there's big slope decreases, those are areas that tend to be really dynamic where you get a lot of damages. And so we've come up with this algorithm building on some past work, building on some UVM research to put you in the high, moderate, or low erosion category. So if you know your project size, you know your category, and then you can get this potential benefit. And I'll just jump through some of so here's again, Kristen kind of did some work categorizing the sediment transport regimes, and that allowed us to do some initial classification of the risk. And then this is a clip of the modeling that Jeremy, Matt, and some others at UVM did. And what we were looking at is both the specific stream power in the channel and the floodplain. And when it gets up into this gray zone, we know that's an area where there's a lot of erosion takes place and channels tend to get really dynamic. So the question we asked on all the subunits was, well, when do you enter this erosion hazard zone? So this is pretty sophisticated modeling that we had in spots to tune our analysis, but now we have it all over the Champlain Basin. So we knew kind of, what storm frequency that the channels entered into this erosion band. And that really helped us set up our values. And then in the end, kind of taking a step back to that original plot, this is another example. So we take our values, we insert our erosion vulnerabilities and our inundation vulnerabilities from the research, and then we have our building, transportation, and ag values, and then we take a % off those. And this is, I'm sorry, we also did an approximate erosion hazard and risk reduction in the headwaters. Again, looking at, in this case, we just used the departure analysis. Evan discussed the lateral connectivity. So if there was stuff in the river corridor at a certain level, we kind of gave it a value. So this is again, another example. This happens to be a floodplain restoration we looked at in Johnson, and we were thinking about how much stuff's around there. And again, you have now, hopefully you have a better understanding of the erosion gross value. So there's $24 million of stuff in the corridors around this project. And then there's a potential reduction based on the erosion screen of about $7 million. And the inundation value is on the similar scale, but you have a lower level of risk reduction due to the inundation hazards.
So was that those risk reduction values? Those somehow represent the benefit of doing?
Yeah, so the scale is applied to the value. So if you have a 10% value, you'll, 23 million, and you'll take 10% of that and scale that down based on implementing this floodplain restoration project. And so when you get to the FFI application, this is the output. There's a whole map piece of it. And what you see is that, and we're going to dig a little deeper into this, but we broke up the value of vulnerable infrastructure and property by building, transportation, and ag, and then we totaled it. And then you can see here the total cost reductions based on those percent reductions. And you can look at that by the individual corridors. The top is a summary of remember, we looked at different corridors up and downstream, depending on where your project is. And then it's broken out inundation and erosion by each corridor. And then there's kind of some more details that you can pull down. So when you choose a project, implement it, and we'll walk through a few examples so you see this, you can kind of get A, what that risk level is, how much value, how much stuff's around you, and then B, what's that potential reduction based on some of the modeling we've done. Take a pause. That was a lot.
I don't want to jump ahead, but I have two things that I'm thinking about. This is very cool. It's also, you're much smarter than me. That's clear. It's hard to
not me.
Get all of it in. But I think, so the two things I'm thinking about, and I don't know if it's something that's within the tool now or that we could use and make a future iteration or what a next step out of it is, but what would be incredibly valuable from my perspective is to have a way to prioritize what are the things that are going to give us that biggest bang for our buck, and in terms of connectivity and risk reduction. So it can help us figure out, instead of just, in a lot of ways with the funding I manage, it's who's coming into us with projects because we don't have the capacity to go out and figure it all out. But if this could help us figure out, this is the best project we could do and how do we pursue that?
Yeah.
That would be incredibly valuable. That's one piece. I have another thought.
Yeah, so there is a version of that in the FFI app now. Tempted to just jump over to it, but I think I should hold off. So we'll go through that, and there's a way to prioritize the functions of connected floodplains. If you wanted to say, I want to drive the risk down, and you click high, it will pull up projects. So there's like a project filtering tool. And what it will do is say, well, what's the value? And honestly, for resiliency, it's probably a little less advanced than for the water quality piece. But it will say, well, if there are if the data in FFI and the geomorphic data say there's good floodplain restoration sites, we know that's good for resiliency. It will sort of flag those as priority projects on that reach when you say, I want to search the criteria by reduction of inundation or reduction of erosion risks. So that's sort of in there, and we'll go over that.
But it's if you're presenting those as options. It's not like it's going to pull options out for you. You have to present a suite of options, and then it'll help to rank them.
Well, basically, you go in through the functions and say, I want high risk reduction. It's going to find all the highest value projects in that subunit or in the HUC 12 watershed at any scale.
Yeah, filtering. Right.
It's going to filter. So we set up this whole filtering system because people want to, this is the question, like, how do you go through and get a list and work through that? And Evan's actually about to start. The next step is really about how do you develop a project kind of using this information.
Okay, we had a couple folks with their hands raised. John, do you still have a question? John, and then Chris.
Stephanie, hi, yeah. Yeah, Stephanie pretty much asked my question. I was going to ask something very similar. If there was there's a ton of valuable metadata here, and if there was a way to normalize the data for local towns, just to say, you know, here's the red and orange and yellow, you know, bad offenders. Where can we have the best bang for our buck? But I think you answered the question. Thanks.
Yeah.
And then Chris Smith, I see you have a question.
Yeah, real quick, good stuff. Where does the cost of restoration or the cost of these projects, is that filtered in? I mean, obviously, when we start to talk about millions and millions of dollars in benefits, that isn't going to, that isn't going to equal the cost of restoration. But at some point, again, how are those costs, or have those costs been factored in, or is it just left at kind of the local level for folks to be figuring those things out, Roy?
Yeah, that's a great question. We went through a whole iteration where we're like, oh, we could like create some level of BCR, like project cost to rate to like the benefit ratio. And we sort of landed on too many moving parts right now when you're screening projects. So what we did was we took the current average unitized cost of every restoration practice we're looking at, and we put it in the planning table that you're going to see this after the break, and we'll show you where that is. So it says, you know, a floodplain restoration project might range like, maybe it's 10. I can't remember the numbers offhand, but like $10,000 per acre is the going price right now. So if I say, you know, if I had a 10-acre project, I know I'm investing at least $100,000. There's a little bit of that kind of baked into on the planning side, and you'll see that information. That might be a really cool step for the future. When you put in your area, you kind of like guesstimate your project cost and reference it against these, you know, some of these values, you know, where you have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of potential reductions, and kind of see is a project worth it.
Excellent, thanks.
Yeah.
And that was my second question, which was, so within FEMA's guidance, we're allowed to present a BCA that's outside of their module, if we have the backup to show how we came up with it. And if there was a different future version of this that was separate from this, but using this data, we could propose our own BCA system to FEMA, and that would be amazing.
Yeah, we started, you know, working with Jessica, who's done a lot of BCAs. Like, we started down this path, and it just took us to places that honestly there were more questions than answers at this sort of like planning level. So it was sort of put in the parking lot, but it would be a really cool project.
Yeah, and
to
we
like
make FEMA pay for it too, which would be cool.
Yeah.
That was what my look to you was.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we could apply under BRIC in December. That should be awesome.
To develop the BCA.
Yeah, to take this and then out of that create.
So Evan, I think
BCA.
we have a little section here on projects. Next 15 minutes, I think, to talk a little more about project development, which I think people are going there naturally, which is great.
Yeah. So I'm going to walk through quickly how we identify, or the types of projects that are considered in the FFI, how we identify them, and how we prioritize them. And there's important caveats on all of that, because I think you all can appreciate there's a lot more work to be done after using the screening tool with actual projects that are preliminarily, you know, identified with this tool. But it's a good start based on the data that we have. So when we talk about projects in the FFI, they're really aiming for improvements in connectivity. And so they tie back to those different connectivity elements that I went over in the methods. So for example, on the screen here, restore connectivity, this bin of project types. This is all about restoring vertical and lateral connectivity in a corridor or floodplain. Similarly, removing constraints, so buildings that are in the way of a healthy river corridor. And then, of course, the protections and revegetation. So without going too deep into this, there was a lot of data at our disposal, geomorphic data and the connectivity data that we developed with this FFI to basically create algorithms by subunits, specific to each subunit, to pull out potential projects based on those characteristics in the corridor. For example, if you're going to consider a floodplain lowering project, you want an incised river, right? Like you're not going to reconnect a river that's already connected, that's not incised. So we're looking at that incision ratio data. Also, if you're going to do a floodplain reconnection project, you probably don't want a lot of stuff in the corridor unless, of course, you have the ability to remove it. So if there's a lot of infrastructure in the corridor, that would dissuade you from a reconnection project. Those sorts of things were considered. And then along that same vein with floodplain lowering, we considered some of the basic geomorphic data about stream sensitivity, some of the, if it were available, data about erosion and aggradation on the reach, level of protection in that corridor. Those sorts of things informed whether a project, if it made it in to the door, is more of a high priority project or a lower priority project. So you'll see that in the FFI, high, medium, low projects. And again, informed not by work on the ground or talking to landowners, but rather data that we have at our fingertips, a remote exercise.
This information sort of goes back to Stephanie's question on priority, right? Like based on the connectivity departure analysis you explained, there's a set of projects we know are out there to reconnect. And with that project, you get all sorts of benefits, right? So that's sort of the thinking. It starts at the connectivity. I just wanted to mention that. And we did a little feasibility. I think the feasibility score includes number of parcels in the subunit, because the more parcels you get, you have more landowner interactions. And then there was also, I think, a size criteria in the initial feasibility score to start us down that path.
Yeah. If you have like one big parcel, for example, and your project sits on one parcel, you're probably going to have an easier time, potentially, depending on the disposition of that one owner, doing the project versus 5 different ones. Same idea with longitudinal and temporal projects. We had that little bit of confusion earlier. It's the same table. We were looking at, removing dams, replacing bridges and culverts, mitigating watershed scale alterations to hydrology, and larger sources of sediment to the river, gullies, that kind of thing. These are all the selection algorithm in this case is quite simple. Is it present on the stream reach? And if it is, it's a potential project. It's that simple. And then how we prioritize these longitudinal and temporal projects. Again, we have, in the case of bridges and culverts, we have on a lot of our rivers, we have geomorphic compatibility and aquatic organism passage data for those structures. Not exhaustive for the whole Lake Champlain Basin, but pretty good coverage. So those sorts of things informed, again, the priority of a culvert replacement. If it's really geomorphically incompatible or has no AOP, get a higher priority. I kind of said this at the beginning, and you'll see this caveat and hear it throughout the day and can see it on the FFI. Again, I think this is probably obvious to most of you. This is a screening level tool, and it's a great starting point, we think, for a list of feasible projects, technically feasible projects based on the data that we have. But a lot more work needs to happen to move those projects forward and vet their feasibility. Namely, you know, what really is on the ground? Does it match the data that we have? And do we have a willing partner on the ground? Yeah, so this slide kind of says that same thing. Outreach is needed as a next step once you have a list of projects. There's a lot of other data out there, again, that we used in the FFI development that you can utilize to at this screening level before more work were to happen on the ground. River corridor plans that compile a lot of geomorphic assessment data. It's been collected, are a great resource. If there's any alternatives analyses that have been done in an area as part of a planning study, those would be a great resource too. But really, if that information isn't available, the next logical step would be to get down on the ground. I think maybe that's the next slide, but for phosphorus crediting,
I think it's a new page.
What you need really, it's pretty basic to calculate a P credit and a resiliency, mitigation dollar value. You need what type of project, and we're going to get into this in the app, so you'll see those are already pre-populated by subunit. You need to have a sense of the size of your project. So Roy was talking about how all the benefits kind of scale based on the size of a reconnection project. For example, a floodplain project, it's less than 1 acre, it's going to have quite a bit less benefit than a 5 or 6 acre project. So you at least need to have like a ballpark idea of the area available for connectivity for reconnection. And then again, the change in vertical connection. Are you going from a super incised state to a fully connected state or somewhere in between? And so the next steps after getting a credit or a resiliency benefit estimate from the tool would be landowner outreach, further data collection on the ground, landowner commitment, and all the subsequent steps that we think about for design and permitting and implementation. And I guess I can go over this as well. But I think we're just about at the break, but just to mention, I don't know if Liz was going to chime in on this, but
She can. Liz, do you want to give a minute overview?
Hello. Yeah, so the habitat co-benefit is definitely in progress. We are using the lens of natural communities on the floodplains, and then working on the in-channel component as well. Roy is leading that based on the reach habitat assessments that have been collected. And we're trying to pull in as well the upland connectivity. So that'll be a new connectivity for the FFI that, takes into account those natural heritage definitions of core habitat and upland definitions as well. So we're excited about the research that's ongoing in this area.
Awesome. Thanks. Mike, do you have anything to add? I know you're instrumental in this piece as well.
For sure.
No, well, we are looking right now to develop relationships between all the connectivity data and different in-stream cover types. So how does connectivity affect reproductive cover and reproductive access? How does connectivity affect different temperature covers that are important for in-stream species and in-stream communities? So we've developed a lot of those models, and we're looking forward to verifying them with the actual field data that has been collected to date.
Thanks.
So this is the third leg of the stool, as Roy was talking about. And the Rivers program always alludes to, and you'll see when we get into the app, the phosphorus crediting module, if you will, is fully built out. The resiliency module is fully built out. And there's a placeholder for habitat co-benefits that will be summarized in the future. I think that brings us to our break. Yeah, we're a little over, I think, according to my watch, but
maybe 10:50, we'll come back and do a stretch, and then we'll play around with the actual tool and application and probably re-explain a lot of the stuff we talked about, but while looking at the app. But together. So yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, bring back questions if you have any at 10:50.
Can folks online hear us?
The other thing.
Just maybe give a thumbs up.
Yeah.
Thank you.
North Carolina. Michael.
All right, 2 thumbs up. All right, so this next session, I don't have the agenda in front of me, but this next session, we're gonna walk you through FFI tool, real basic stuff. Have a computer, of course, you're sitting in front of a computer if you're remote. So if you want to follow along while I do this, feel free. If you just want to watch, that's fine too. So there's sort of, this is the splash screen of the FFI, and you see the URL up here that I think Stacy put into the chat. There's sort of 2 options here that you're presented with at the very beginning. You can just explore map data or do project planning. And I'm just going to click this explore map data. When I'm done, just to switch it up, Roy's going to get in and cover this project planning button, which also shows up here in the upper left. So my job right now is just to kind of show you the key functionality of this tool. And please, if you have any questions as we're going along, just give a shout out and stop me. I'll try to go relatively slow. Also not look at the big screen because that makes it hard for me to. Okay, so we're going to start. It's got a search tool. I think you'll find is pretty similar to web applications that you're used to, mapping applications in particular. This is built off of like an Esri, Esri, the company that builds ArcGIS, off of one of their sort of templates. It's obviously pretty enhanced beyond the basic template. Again, all this was created by Stone Environmental. So I'm going to just start with a search and zoom in on where we're sitting today. I think it's State Drive. So we're right here. The default background is this topography and kind of hillshade layer with the labels on the roads. You can also do the aerial photo if you'd like. So I'll zoom back in, and we're all sitting in this building here, I believe. Again, the default, I'll just zoom out a few clicks here. There's a few things that are on by default. And we'll see those if we click on this layers button here and expand this. The river corridors are on here, the streams with different symbology by size and by gradient. And because this tool is really tailored initially to phosphorus crediting and planners that are thinking about phosphorus reduction studies that are known as the WPD, Sheds Project Database from DEC. Those are also shown up here on default, by default. So you could click on one of these, for example, see there has been a past project just up the road here by Crosset Brook. It was a planting project. It was status says it was completed. And I could click here and get a bit more information about it from that Watersheds Project database if I wanted. We're not really going to focus on this today, but since that pops up as a default, I wanted to point that out. I'll collapse that. Really what we want you guys to understand is, everything that we showed you with the connectivity methods and the projects, I want to at least get into that. So for example, here we are, and if I click on a corridor, there we go. I see that a subunit, it gets highlighted. Again, we're along the Winooski River here. The full reach of the Winooski River that was delineated in a past geomorphic assessment is this highlighted yellow here. So it's much longer, kind of starts upstream of the village of Waterbury, extends downstream. But within that reach, we have multiple subunits. Again, you can kind of see where these tributaries come in, see how these subunits are divvied up based on hydrography. So a few other just basic naming conventions that I touched on and the methods. If I click on a subunit, you'll see in the upper right here, there's an ID. This says R13. R13 would be the 13th river reach on the Winooski River that was part of a geomorphic assessment project, I believe. And 5 indicates that it's, I believe, the 5th subunit up in this reach. And the C is corridor, and these other values here are empty. They indicate floodplains or, help me out, Roy.
Upland.
Yeah, okay, the future.
For future.
Yeah, for the habitat piece. So these are basically indicating the scale and that you're looking at. Alternatively, if I click on the stream, now I see, again, we were just looking at a subunit of this overall reach R13, and it's actually got for those of you, if you're familiar with SCAT, the tool that is used to delineate reaches and collect data about them, geomorphic data about them, here's the original SCAT ID. So I'll come back to this subunit and come back into the feature data here. Oops. And we can get some information right off the bat about this corridor. So I see that the river corridor acre of this subunit is about 150 acres. About 40% of it is connected, which means that about 60% of it has constraints. And I can get other information here. Again, this level of protection rank kind of in the middle, indicating there probably are some protections with FEMA map floodplains and floodways, but and actually, I don't know if in Waterbury there's a river corridor hazard overlay in the zoning regs. No, okay. So that's not reflected here. So that's probably explaining why this value is a bit lower. So 100 would be the highest level of protection if, for example, this entire subunit had a river corridor easement on it. Area of the 50-foot riparian area, 14 acres, about half of that is vegetated, naturally vegetated. So again, we get an overall lateral connectivity score of 45, pretty low, which we sort of expect in this setting with a lot of buildings and constraints and even agricultural land in the corridor. We also get basic information about the phosphorus load. Again, going back to that sort of heat map that Roy showed earlier, where we start with an allocation at the HUC 12 level. So this would be some portion of the Winooski River Basin. And we had that allocation tree that sort of trickles the phosphorus on down to the different bins and then to the sub and the size. So this being a pretty disconnected subunit because of where it is and all the infrastructure, it would, and a decent size, 150 acres. Is that right? 150 acres, okay. It gets a pretty high stream stability load, 150 kilograms per year associated with this subunit. Any questions so far on this connectivity data?
Is that 150 kilograms per year of phosphorus from this stretch that's exported?
That's the estimate, yep, from the TMDL and the data, exactly.
So if there were things we could do here to improve it, we would try to bring that number down.
Correct.
And whatever the difference is our credit.
You got it.
Okay.
Yep.
That number would go down as connectivity goes up. So reconnect a floodplain. It could even be just going out to this cornfield and revegetating the whole thing. You'd actually get a small credit for that on the water quality side. Wouldn't do much on the resiliency side, maybe get a small bump. Evan, one thing, could you like just go pull down the legends and zoom out for the departure analysis? Yeah, like the color coding, because kind of make some stuff out right away.
Okay.
To do that.
In the layers here, or?
Yeah, like right there.
Perfect. Yep. Yeah. Sorry about that. I didn't get into this. So when like default information that you get up right off the bat is the stream connectivity score. So these use different shades of blue here. Lightest blue is connected. Darker blue is fragmented. Again, that's both longitudinal and temporal connectivity together. And then the lateral and vertical components here, same theme. Darker shading is more or less connected, more constrained, and lighter shading is more connected, less constrained. So that's why when we're zoomed out at this scale, it might be easier to see here. You know, you can kind of see the patterns on the landscape, right? Where there's you know, developed urban areas with a lot of residences and commercial buildings, what have you. We're going to have darker corridors in comparison to more rural areas, lighter. This is, you know, gives you an indication of connectivity. I think, yeah, those are the sort of baseline departure and connectivity scores. There's a lot of other information I'll get to, depending on time, in a minute here. I did want to just, let's go back to our subunit here. So we went through the connectivity details. Let's see what kind of projects are were identified here. There's no berms. There is a flood chute present. We have a potential wetland restoration project. River corridor bylaws answer that question. Do they exist? No. And we get some ratings here of different things that feed into the project prioritization. We have a high incision ratio. And that was, if I go back here, I see the incision ratio is 1.7. Generally, anything over 1.5 is a pretty high incision ratio. That means there's the bank full level is well below the top of the bank, so it's not spilling out of the floodplain that frequently. Without going into all of it here, we've got other feasibility ratings, again, based on the number of parcels, et cetera. Stream sensitivity is high. This was sort of a key rating that we used in some of the project prioritization. And then, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I'll just say, then we can actually see what projects were identified based on those algorithms we were talking about earlier. Adopt river corridor bylaws. That would make sense. Create a flood bench. Now, a full floodplain reconnection is not identified here, likely because there's too many constraints. In other words, we're sort of accepting that State Street or State Drive and the infrastructure around it's probably not going to move anytime soon. So the space that's left to create a reconnection project would be narrower, probably be more like a flood bench than a full floodplain. We can plant some buffers, might be able to remove some minor constraints. We don't, there's no like tipping point on what's a minor major constraint. Generally, like removing a minor constraint suggests that maybe smaller pieces of infrastructure might be removable to achieve a reconnection, whereas a structure with a major constraint.
On the adopting the bylaw,
yeah,
is that going to change your scores for other things and improve your, is it theoretically like improving your resilience or phosphorus scores?
I think you're asking like if a project is implemented or a new zoning bylaw implemented. Is it specific to that one thing, the bylaw? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that was listed as a priority project, and I understand why it's really valuable to have those bylaws and, implement easements, but it just, I wasn't sure if just by enacting that, you would improve your scores without changing anything.
Yeah, you would, because your level of protection would likely change. I'm not sure it would, how much it would change by adding that. But again, that level of protection, which is 35% of the lateral connectivity score, would get tweaked, and there would be some kind of credit.
Yeah, it's a little abstract. It took me a while to digest this one way back when we started the methods, but remember the target is like laterally vertically connected and protected forever at every high level. So you have no protections and you do river corridor bylaws, you're going to get a credit for that. That whatever's there will be there functioning for a long period of time.
I think Chris Smith does have a question, but I think the other thing too is the idea is if you have protection, you don't have infrastructure in that area. It allows the river to also re-access and recreate floodplain over time. So it's not what is it today? Like when I look out the window, what is it today? It's what is it in 10 years? If we're not allowing new things to go in there, that puts constraints on that reach of river. Now you're allowing the river to take time to reconnect, to build its own floodplain over 10, 20, 30, 50 years, whatever it might be.
So it's not like you're making an improvement right now, but you're preventing something that would,
prevent it from happening in the future. And it gives the river room to do that.
Okay.
And make that reconnection.
Chris, you got a question?
Yeah, Evan, real quick. Before it talked about all the projects that were identified there or potential projects, and then these are priority projects. For example, wetland restoration was listed as a project, and I think you got to that through some of the different components that might be seen in the reach. I'd like to learn more about how you were identifying those wetland restoration projects, but not now. My question really is around how did you get from projects identified to priority projects?
Yeah. So data that's available that informed a lot of the FFI. So for example, take a floodplain reconnection project. If it were identified because there's an incised, reach there, what might differentiate high-low would be, is there a lot of stuff in the corridor or is there not? Because if you have an incised reach and there's not a lot of infrastructure in the corridor, it's going to be easier, most likely, to reconnect that river, reconnect that floodplain than if there is a lot in the corridor. So one simple example of prioritization.
Okay, thank you.
I think the wetlands projects came off of the state wetland priority projects list. And I think this list is the high projects. So there could be wetlands on there at a lower moderate level. And sometimes I should say, like, there could be a floodplain restoration project in this reach, like it just may not be getting selected. And if you kind of know the details, like an incision ratio 1.7, there's that piece along River Road and there's a lot of erosion there. And I think the reason there's not a big project is that road is kind of in the way. But who knows if that road gets moved a little bit and there could be a project there. Just keep that.
So you pulled in that wetland layer for wetland restoration. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought it was just based on that there's a wetland present. Or did you use the Lake Champlain wetland?
There's a wetland restoration priority layer, I believe, that we use for this.
Because there's some wetlands in
There's some wetlands in the area or some alteration. I think there was a previous analysis. We wanted to include that.
Yeah, I would need to, I'm a little foggy, honestly, on that
If you
piece.
turn on like what layer is on, maybe is background data or is it under FFI derived? Is there a wetland?
So now, okay. Just going to turn this off for 1 second so you can see. And I'm kind of, Stacy's causing me to jump ahead a little bit, which is good. Background data, you can see, these little arrows here. You can get to more information here. And I just came down and clicked on BSWI class layer. So these are Vermont Significant Wetlands Inventory. And all you have to do is click on the eyeball there and it'll pop up. So these are actually known mapped wetlands. And we'll have to check on the source of that, like present wetland restoration potential. I can't remember off the top of my head if it's that prioritization layer that Roy was referring to. There's other infrastructure here, E911, roads, buildings, dams, and then other sort of basic boundaries, towns, parcels, etc. And if you really wanted to dig deep into some of those underlying connectivity scores at a HUC 12 level, or this might take a minute to populate because it's a big layer, the protections. You can click on these. I will warn you, you notice I just clicked on that. It's taking a while to populate because this is like that kind of weighted area based on a lot of information protection layer that we used for the protection score and connectivity. Yeah, the hand floodplains are pretty interesting.
It only shows up to the 500 year, right?
The baseline is the 500 year. And so again, these floodplains are delineated in sort of unison with the river corridor subunit. So we use those divisions to slice up these floodplains. So click on one where that will align with the river corridor if I turn that back on. I think we just put the 500 year on here, nothing else for now.
And that doesn't identify projects separately than the corridor. So like if you click on the floodplain, it doesn't pull up.
No, no, all the projects live on, that's a good question, actually. All the projects live on the stream layer or the corridor layer. So in other words, we'll do this a bit later. When you see this yellow highlight, it means, you know, you've got to reach, and there's data in there actually to add to the project screening. So just a little preview. And whatever projects might show up on this longer river reach, stream connectivity projects, longitudinal temporal based, I can click on this add to project screening, and now up pops. This is where we're going to go deeper in a minute. All those projects that were identified along that stream reach, and we have to do some selections to actually extract information about those projects and their benefits. Anything else from a basic overview that you can think of? Okay. Any questions about functionality? Okay. I'll pass it to Roy, who's going to do some of the project.
Continue a little more. Yeah. Okay, so I'm actually going to click the home button, sort of start over. So maybe do that if you're following along. And Evan clicked explore map, and then the other button is begin new project planning, or you can click up here. So, and then select project criteria and choosing scale. Maybe we keep picking on Waterbury since we're here.
You could type it in actually.
We can.
I just did that too. Yeah. Scrolling's going. Okay.
And now select project filter criteria. And this goes back to the, like, how you want to pick your projects. And if you click functions, this menu comes up and you can prioritize nutrient load reduction from unstable streams, increase floodplain storage, floodplain habitat mosaics, in-stream cover mosaics. So this is the habitat piece, and then reduction of erosion-related damages and reduction of inundation-related damages here.
Can you only pick one?
You can pick as many as you want. And these are dynamic, so maybe we'll pick both of these two. And then function applicability. Now, this list gets filtered based on what you select above. So if there's only high, medium, or low, you only see one option there. I'm just going to click high. The other ways you can pick, if you want to search out a project that FFI has screened for, like all the floodplain restoration projects in the Winooski or the Matt or, Thatcher Brook or whatever, you can kind of do that here. So you can pick any kind of project, and then you pick your project priority. So if I want to know, like, what are the best buffer plantings in the area? Again, I've kind of had mixed results with the filtering. It's based on what data are here in this database, and it's a GIS tool. So sometimes it says there's no buffer plantings, and you're like, there are buffer plantings out there. We kind of know that. But the GIS data says that it's all naturally vegetated for some reason. And, it might either be below the resolution or the land cover changed, and FFI didn't know that. So just be aware as you filter. So let's hit C projects, and this planning up. And this is really the avenue at which you get to do calculations and explore your benefits. I almost think what I might want to do, let's just pick a corridor. Again, we picked stuff in Waterbury. Remember, you can look at the codes and get a little bit, like if you see a C00, you kind of know you're in the river corridors. If you see PHG, that means perennial high gradient. And then if you see PLG, perennial low gradient, and if you see another number that looks like an stream geomorphic assessment number, then you know you're in a lower valley and that has a designated state river corridor. So with a little practice, you can kind of figure out. You can see this returned many options, and I'm just going to pick one. Notice there's the connectivity score. This is like high level planning data, feasibility score, what that phosphorus load assignment is. And then what I almost go to this first, what that incision ratio is. It really kind of highlights what your level of vertical disconnection is. Like here's couple that jump out at 1.6. Here's some that say 4.2, which I'm not sure what's going on there. 1.3, 3.3. So it's kind of all over the place. You know, I kind of want to pick one in the middle here. So I might just pick on one reach. And if you click on it, you can start to see the projects, the priority projects. And then you can see a typical cost, the per acre, and then what a simulated P credit would be. So I don't even need to do anything else. If I wanted to just really roughly say, you know what, I'm thinking of a corridor in this spot and it's 10 acres. I kind of know I'm dealing with $10,000, $100,000 project, and I'm probably getting like, 8 acres, 8 kilograms of P per year based on that project. Like that can be where you stop. There isn't resiliency data other than the typical project costs, which Chris was asking about kind of in this area. So you can kind of click through and find out what's going on with projects. See, there's a restore wetland. Now here's one that says lower floodplain, $50,000 to $300,000 per acre, 2.1. So, if you sort of find a project, you're like, oh, this seems intriguing. You can click on the magnifying glass, and the map zooms to the area. I'm just going to zoom out to see. So it looks like we're right downstream of the reservoir on the little river here. It's calling out a floodplain area. And I can click on that and look at the feature data, as Evan was saying. And again, one thing I like to do is I tend to go to this incision ratio. It says it's super incised. I'm not sure that reading looks like it's an SCAT value.
Well, yeah, it's probably worth noting on that note. Incision ratio, a measure of connectivity. We kind of had a hierarchy of data. If it's a field measurement, that's in there. If there's no field measurement, we estimated it with a LiDAR-based tool that we developed in this project. But of course, being a remote tool, there's always going to be an anomaly. So we probably just clicked one.
Yeah. Here's another spot that's intriguing. Looks like the next downstream reach. Little River Road here. So if you click on this, you can also click on the stacked layers, and it brings up the corridor data, and you can sort of look in the area. Now, if I wanted to consider some more information, I would click on this box here, which go to the top so you see it, add to project calculations. It's a little hard to move around with this giant list. And what you see is when you click on that box, the calculation inputs tab turns yellow. And that's because it's now like waiting for information from you in that piece. So you click on calculation inputs. And what you see is the floodplain, the lateral vertical, and storage crediting tab comes up. And here are the proposed projects. So these are projects that had high, that were selected through that algorithm behind FFI. And the high priority projects are checked. And you may or may not be doing these projects. We could say that we're just solely lowering the floodplain. And for phosphorus crediting, this doesn't, it doesn't really matter what you click, except for it puts it on a list on the next page, which I'll show you. But it's for resiliency crediting, it matters because you have to know what kind of project it is to know like what sort of benefits you might get. Everything is really area based. Remember, we have to put it in an area category for the resiliency calculation. And you fill out all this information right here for the P calculations. So I almost want to make some stuff up and just take a quick peek at the calculation right while we're all here following along. And one thing you'll note is we encountered this incision ratio anomaly a couple places. And so we made it possible to adjust the existing incision ratio.
Ask if you could edit your.
Yeah, so like what happened was like we would do a project on a berm removal and the SGA data said the incision ratio was 1.0, but we knew like it was like 1.9 in the 500 feet the berm existed. So we couldn't get the credit if we didn't like have the right incision ratio and vertical reconnection. So now, and in this case, 4.2 is not a realistic incision ratio. Turns it must be that the computer methodology we use to approximate incision ratios or the field measurement was really wonky or got entered wrong. We just don't know. And we can just say, we think it's 1.9, you know, just for giggles as we're doing this.
We have a couple hands up. Mike has a question and then it looked like Chris Smith had a question.
Hey, go ahead.
Yeah, Roy, I was just going to mention a couple possibilities down on that reach of the Little River. One, I think there is a bedrock controlled almost orgy area down through there that may have been read as a high incision ratio, which would be natural. And the other factor is, of course, with the reservoir up there, there was a tremendous amount of incision due to starving of that reach. So not going to claim that 4.2 is correct, but it's not necessarily wild.
All right. With that, I'm going to leave it at 4.2 for this exercise. Thanks. Chris. Okay. Chug along. So everything you put in here is for the project values. And we're going to run through a few examples. So what I mean by that is I don't put in the values that are proposed as a whole once the project is implemented. It's what does the project do specifically. So unconstrained river corridor, this is the area where there's not houses and buildings. And if we were going to remove something like a road or a bridge or a culvert or a house, we would change this value. If let's just for giggles, I just want so you can see what this looks like. If I'm going to add 5-acre river corridor to this project, let's do a 5-acre floodplain reconnection and add a river corridor. I'm just going to put a 5 in the robust protections, and then I'm going to take it out of the moderate protections. I'm going to put -5. Yeah, so it's just the project. Maybe there's a FEMA floodway or floodplain that lands in the moderate category, and we're going to put a river corridor easement on it. So we are sure no river management is going to happen.
So you put -5, you don't put 17.3.
Exactly. You don't have to do it. You just put like the project specific.
Okay.
And then we'll just say the buffer is staying the same. One thing you have to check is it's saying this buffer is 3.5 acres are naturally vegetated. And it says the whole 50-foot buffer is 3.6 acres. So most of the buffer is naturally vegetated. So if I put a 1 in, it would give me an error, like you're trying to vegetate more than what's out there. So you'd have to put a 0.1 in here to fully vegetate the buffer, which we're just going to leave. So the proposed incision ratio, let's be naive to what Mike said and say we're going to do the biggest vertical restoration and make it a really connected floodplain. Sounds like it may not be possible because the bedrock gorge that might exist here.
And Roy, just because you're going to show the resilience, be sure to check your river corridor easement box up at the top.
Okay, will do. Thank you. And then I think we said we're just going to make it a 5-acre project. You know what? Let's do it. I wonder if we should, maybe let's make it a 4-acre project because then we'll know for sure category it's in, right? Well, I guess it's all right. 5's in the middle. We'll go for the middle category. All right. And then, so that's it. And that's all it is. There's a storage component, which I'm not going to touch on right now. And I just hit calculate. Calculation successful. And you see here now the water quality benefit and the floodplain resiliency benefit tabs are highlighted. Water quality, it says we get 11.4 kilograms per year benefit. And this is it projected to 15 years. One thing you'll notice, the subunit IDs are carried to the results, the town, what we are proposing to do, and then the project area, because those are the dominant factors. I'll just show you this. This is the details of the calculations in case you wanted to look at that. And then we'll go to the resiliency piece. And looks like there's no buildings in the area. There's some transportation infrastructure, no ag. And then this is the total you add up. And then the potential reductions. It looks like there's a small potential reduction for erosion based on the information. And if I go down to the ranking, so this is the, remember the inundation, you see how this says 0, F0, that just to confirm you're in the 500-year floodplain. No value, the vulnerability rank is low and you're staying low. Now, if we look at the erosion, it's a little more interesting. There's a little bit of value there and the vulnerability existing rank is low, and we're going to drive that down to low. So there is a potential benefit on the erosion side for this project, given the setting. And then if you wanted to get some more details, you can kind of pull down this menu and see how it's split apart. Pretty straightforward because it's one corridor and one project, and you can kind of see how the values sort of match the details. It gets a little more complicated when you have multiple reaches and projects sort of adding together. In this case, it didn't, based on the project information. So that's the planning table in a nutshell. I think I'll pause there.
How does that relate? Like there's the total value of 563,000 subject to potentially being eroded.
That's right, in the river corridor.
Okay, and you could potentially reduce that to being only 338,000? Is that what that potential reduction means?
I think that's the value. It could be reduced.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the value could be reduced.
And so we're getting 2/3 of that by doing what we're doing.
Yeah,
that's right.
Okay.
So there will only be $200 and something thousand left of.
yeah. And remember this, you picked a 5-acre project, so it's actually extending a couple subunits downstream and maybe one upstream because it's a big project. And so the value reduction reflects the step that's in not just the subunit where the project's happening, but a couple down. In the case of erosion, I believe it's a couple downstream, maybe one upstream. In
Okay.
case of inundation, and we're talking about flood, water surface elevations being lowered, not just movement of materials, erosion, et cetera. That extends a bit more upstream as well.
So is the 563, is that just the subunit?
No,
Does that extend?
This is the total.
That's the total inclusive of any subunit that would be affected by this project.
So the reduction is the percentage. Yeah, I think that's right. Any other questions? So we got about 20 minutes. We have a couple case studies of projects. We thought we would look at some of the values and just kind of keep working on the app again and follow the leader format. So let me just hop over to the slides. This one in about 10 minutes. So here's the Dog River project where there was a lot of buyouts along Water Street and a floodplain restoration project through berm removal in Northfield. I think many of you know about the project. And this shows a section where this berm was removed and the area is quite flood prone. You can see this is the 100-year flood level above the whole project site. And there's actually two lines there, and it shows the existing proposed flood levels for a big flood aren't changing. A subtle decline in the 10-year and 2-year flood levels. What it does is it allows water to spread out a little more on this reconnected floodplain that's now a park. 3.1 acres, 2 to 6 feet of fill removal, and 9,000 cubic yards.
Roy, before you go on, Stephanie, you have a question online?
Yes, could you clarify who the lead party was on these projects? Are these municipal projects?
This project was a combination of a town, Friends of the Winooski, and BEM played a big role in it, as well as DEC, so big collaboration.
It was, I think, originally led by the town after Irene, working with homeowners to do buyouts that then evolved into a larger floodplain.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question, Stephanie?
It does, and I'm finding myself, my come to this, webinar with really just helping towns develop local hazard mitigation plans. And I'm looking at this tool and I'm having a hard time figuring out how the town, in what circumstances would it be appropriate for projects that you might identify in this tool being led by the town. So just for what it's worth.
Yeah.
It might be like a two-part type of project, similar to like the Dog River site, where you might have buyouts that a town is looking to support that could evolve duration, or it's like a multiple partner type of project.
Stephanie, are you asking if the town would use the tool or more how the town might use the information from the tool?
I don't think, this is complex. I can't envision somebody, like I'm working with the town of Castleton right now, so I'm trying to follow along with this tool in Castleton. I can't picture somebody from the town of Castleton using this tool. I think the level of complexity this is a pretty sophisticated thing. So I'm just trying to figure out like how I could use this to help a community identify projects in that category of natural systems protection mitigation actions. And so I'm just kind of struggling to get my head around, you know, how a town might be a lead on some of these problem areas when they're not really projects on town property or within town right of ways or things of that nature. So
Stephanie, I'll just toss out my 2 cents for what it's worth. The way that I've kind of pictured this tool with the communities would be a person like yourself, or perhaps, you know, a watershed group or other folks who are doing planning within, say, if you're working on the hazard mitigation plan, what areas in town may be opportunities for floodplains, what areas may be areas that are zoned for development but may have flood areas. How might the community look at resources that they could help them reduce their flood risks? And then the tool may be able to help identify what some of those areas could offer for benefits and cost considerations or types of projects. And that information kind of being brought to the town as part of their planning process to kind of, you know, facilitate a discussion of like, hey, this was zoned for development, but it's also, you know, a really great floodplain opportunity. How might that look in the community if we were to protect it versus it being developed? Or we're looking to do, this area has been identified in a hazard mitigation plan as a potential project. Here's some additional information that helps us identify some of the co-benefits that could be looked at in, say, your FEMA application considerations. So that's kind of how I've been picturing it to be used. And then, as you said, from the community aspect, you know, there will be some projects like in that the town may lead because they are helping sponsor the grant or, say, a FEMA buyout. But other projects may come to the town through watershed groups and folks that are bringing it to the community as they could take the lead on it, but the town helps, you know, support the project because they see the additional benefits they can receive from that project. I guess that's how I've been picturing it. Other folks can certainly chime in. Mike, it looks like you had your hand up.
Yeah, Stacy, you answered that question pretty much like I would have. That was a great response. I think in this particular case, you know, the town was pursuing the buyouts. And so all the other partners that Roy mentioned, or many of the other partners that Roy mentioned, would probably be more comfortable with this tool and could come to Northfield's aid to say, and by the way, this buyout could result in the following water quality benefits, the following flood resiliency benefits as calculated through the FFI, which then could go on and help Northfield with some of the fundraising that occurred to make this project happen. So that's kind of how towns are going to enter projects in different ways, but it's going to be some of these other partners like the RPCs, the you know, clean water service providers that are very adept at using this tool, but are also helping towns with local hazard mitigation planning, which maybe, you know, step in and provide the town with some of the data that would come from this, as you say, very sophisticated tool.
Okay, I see two more hands, Caroline and then John.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on, so Stephanie's question is a really great question that, you know, the tool is complex, so we can't necessarily expect a town staff person to be able to figure out how to identify projects with it. So I think it's part of our role to figure out how to direct them towards support in this tool and who those power users are going to be, as Ben Rose puts it, power users. But I envision it being, you know, within a local hazard mitigation plan, you could say that you want to pursue using this tool at a certain site that you know needs to be addressed in terms of flood vulnerability. So integrating it that way and then figuring out who the right partners are, as you have just discussed. So figuring out how to coordinate everyone. And I think it is a really great tool for figuring out the next step from a local hazard mitigation plan. and addressing those vulnerabilities and figuring out exactly what that specific project should be.
It's not your first stop.
Thank you,
It's like
Chair.
your second or third stop on the.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah, really good information, and I would generally agree with everything that's just been said. They kind of addressing some of the things I had thought of from a hydrologist standpoint. We kind of have an analogous situation going on here with NOAA, where we're going to be rolling out flood inundation mapping that's modeled for heavy rainfall events, and it's an interactive tool. I won't bore you with the details, but it's complex, and we're going to be rolling out training on it. But the issue is going to be around who's going to use it. It's pretty complex, and we as NOAA need to be the point of contacts as the experts on to help inform them make good decisions during high water. And I envision the same thing going on with this tool, that somebody at the state level, or you can debate on who that would be kind of a POC or a group of people that a town, if they didn't have a local expert, could turn to use this tool as a foundation to move forward to make better decisions on, as we mentioned, cost benefit ratios and things like that. What's the, here are the 3 target areas. What's the best benefit of the town based off the money we need to spend or what we can get through grant money? So I think there needs to be kind of a tiered approach of rolling this out to the communities. You're only going to have a few people, maybe more than you think, but some people that are going to use it. Other towns won't, and it may be a little bit too technical for them. But we need to have a approach where who can they turn to point them on how to understand what this tool is telling them, because it's very powerful, a lot of metadata in there.
Thank you. Is there another question? I see one more hand up. Is that someone, Steve?
I think that's just Jeff's legacy hand.
Okay.
Or John's, sorry.
Okay. All right. We'll move forward. So here's the Dog River Park, and yeah, the town's probably the thing the town focused on the most was this park creation, as well as the buyouts, and then friends of the Winooski and others, and like myself, we designed the floodplain restoration aspect of it and the trails and whatnot. Some folks using the area, and then here's a couple photos right after last few years. The floodplain's been active on with some sedimentation and inundation. And here's I'm going to jump into the FFI tool. Oops. Okay, I'm going to just go in and explore Water Street. Okay, and I'm going to do this real quick. I will say the tool feels really complex when you start, but the more you play around with it, it's actually quite simple to do. And we kind of played around with the data inputs and kept forcing ourselves. It's just area. And one other little thing we didn't really show you was there is an area tool if you just wanted an area that you're looking at to consider, and then you could plug it in to really understand what kind of area and what project you're working on. I know this project happened on both sides of Union Brook. You can see the disconnection, so I'm just going to quickly add those to the screening table. All right, so you're going to see the speed version of this, and we removed a berm. Also planted the 50-foot buffer and implemented a river corridor easement.
Would you note the move major constraints, Roy, or?
I think what we realized, the mapping we used to make this had those out of it.
Okay, had already
been out of it.
And like the difference on this side too, like removing berm versus lowering floodplain.
Yeah, I mean, we could check. We probably want to do. We did a little bit of both of those actually, so I think we'll check both.
And when you say like plant floodplain, plant river border, that's where you're doing more beyond the 50-foot buffer, but and that's in there where you
That's right.
Yeah.
So,
Did you implement an easement?
oh dear.
Yes, it's all deed restricted from the FEMA buyouts.
Yeah.
So it would be considered like a easement.
Okay, so there's our project. You can see incision ratio 1.9. This is the downstream reach, and we did 1 acre. So I'm just gonna 1 minus 1, oops. Minus 1 to get a moderate. And the proposed incision was 1.2. We did that over 1 acre. And then on the upstream reach, you can see the incision ratio says 1.0, but we know it was 1.9 at the berm. And the area, oops, wrong area. The area was 2.1, so minus 2.1. And here, I forgot to enter the veg 1. And
Shannon.
what's that?
Shannon was,
Shannon noted that a deed restriction does not limit channel management or require a buffer
versus an easement.
versus an easement.
Okay. So we should take that piece off. Is that the idea? Which I'm happy to do.
More of a moderate protection than a
Okay.
robust.
All right, let's just take that off then. So remove berm, lower flame, plant that. And I don't think we checked quarter, but we will remove these two. Yep. And notice here, 2.1 acres, but part of it is already just added the rest, the remainder that we vegetated. And then hit calculate. Let's look at the water quality benefit real quick, 4.2 per year. And then we'll focus on the resiliency piece. Again, so you see the corridors now, there's 2 corridors listed, the town, remove berm, plant 50-foot buffer, lower the floodplain. Project area was total 3 acres. And then, so there's a lot of infrastructure in this area. So many millions of dollars, no ag, but you can see the transportation. There's bridges and culverts in these stretches. And, pretty substantial potential reductions based on a couple feet up and downstream, and then the 4% reduction per foot and the project size. Then you can kind of see a summary. Now, one thing you'll notice is that you're still, and this is a true reflection of the site, like based on our sort of resiliency, like our categories of risk, you're really not dropping them down just because there's still a lot of infrastructure that's flood prone in this area. And this was something we made a point to talk about through the whole design and implementation process. Like, yeah, you're going to change the local flood dynamics and you're going to see some sedimentation on that low floodplain and periodic inundation. But when that big flood comes, there's water on Water Street still. And maybe the river moves around a little less and the channel's a little more stable because it has some area to move now and isn't bermed. And there is utility in the area that's in a better state, but still a pretty high residual risk in this area, which is a true reflection of the site.
So, Roy, that reflects the segment upstream or downstream that was also included in the resilience consideration. So for Heather's question, that last, total, it looks like under your vulnerability reduction, I see a M12B, M12B, M13. So it's showing that my reduction's coming in at my site and at the next segment upstream of me.
Yeah, well, these are the 2 corridors that we selected. So it's already including, on the upstream one, it includes up and downstream.
Okay.
And then this one just focuses on,
But you have to know the little table you had,
Yeah.
as far as like, when it gets to this.
That's right.
This segment or that.
So you have to sort of refer back to that table to really know exactly how to interpret this table right here.
Okay, of which, how many,
Yeah, like are you 1 or 2 up? And so that's sort of like, I think that's behind all this.
okay,
When you're choosing the project,
See if-
because a big piece of this is also the removal of all the homes. That's not part of the selection that can be made, right? That's not one of the options. They considered separate from.
So constraint removal it is in there. Let me think, but because our data sort of views that as not, that homes weren't there, like
Start from.
to start, it's sort of
It's already
gone. It's already accounted for.
And that's just because the age of the data
Yeah.
is newer than the.
In the homes, yeah, we just got the land cover data. It was new.
Is that upstream, downstream piece, when you've selected two that are right next to each other? Is that intelligent so that doesn't double count?
I believe so, yeah. Talk to Evelyn, who did the calculations.
so it sounds like then if I'm reading your table right on the vulnerability reduction, that on M13, you would get 100% reduction for the erosion in the corridor for vulnerability?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's because everything's out of the corridor and it's, it's kind of in its connected state now.
Yeah, okay.
But the inundation vulnerability remains really high, especially in M12.
Right.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm sort of hearing is probably we'll have this table in the user guide and have like call outs to like every cell and like what exactly they contain.
That'd be great.
Not to get too stuck on this hypothetical, but let's just say that the land cover data set had still included those homes. When you do constraint removal, I'm assuming that you're having to bring the total value of structures removed to input it. So you're like, it's not like you're putting in like, you're not able to select the houses and pull from like.
Yeah, no, that's a little more detailed. So what you would do is hit constraint removal. I don't know if, just trying to think what the right approach would be. I think you would just hit that constraint removal and
Like provide the data of the value.
yeah, so I guess what I would say is like, that almost feels like we're kind of going backwards, right? We've done the design, the project's implemented, now we're going back to this. You do this first, right? And then you say, okay, well, there's 12 houses getting removed, their values are this. And then you sort of like, you'd probably be refining this initial estimate really, as you like did a buyout. Because what this is going to do is like you hit constraint removal, and you give it an area, and it's all about those like typical average values for home. Like it could even get the building type wrong.
Yeah, because there's
aggregate value could be off.
Yeah. I mean, and that kind of market factor changes so wildly. It's almost like you need to bring your own numbers to it than using any sort of default numbers. I was just thinking like if you're going from the beginning of a project, like the question that Stephanie had asked earlier is the idea of like you're trying to work with the town like Castleton to say, how do we look at this site that you have flood issues?
Yeah.
So you could add those pieces. It's like you don't want to use any defaults in there. You want to use something that's more up to date when you're thinking about like home buyouts,
Yeah.
A larger floodplain restoration.
Yeah, I think once you get to that level, like when you're considering implementing a buyout, to know like what is that property worth in detail. But if you're thinking about a flood prone area and you're saying, well, there's a floodplain potential restoration potential here, this is the tool to say, well, you could get this water quality benefit, this resiliency benefit. Like it says there's like millions of dollars of stuff all around here. And if we can bump that flood level down a little bit, here's the benefit you could see. Like what if the modeling says, what, it's not a 2-foot reduction, it's a 1-foot reduction. Well, then you're kind of like cutting this value in half to start. And then what if it says, well, that property was worth a little more, or a little less. So your design information would kind of refine this with like project specific stuff.
Okay.
But this is like maybe like a way you say, wow, according to some initial estimates, you got $1 million of stuff right in here, including your road, that runs through Castleton, and there's a potential project here, and you also get a water quality benefit, and it's going to help the river too.
And then a project can be built from that.
Yeah, and then you would sort of like, and as you do design, like when we did that, so we've done this before, and then we said, well, oh, this berm removal is going to happen, but it's a little longer, so we come back here and check it, and then now we're like doing a little more field work and refining it. So it's a little, that's why I said early on, it's a little back and forth, and then you kind of build from there, refine those numbers.
Hey, folks, we're right at time.
I want to respect people's time and appreciate folks coming.
Maybe
Thank you,
close
Stephanie.
remark.
I don't know if, I see Mike might have a question or a comment, but I don't know if you have any other examples or anything so we're good here. We're gonna,
if folks have questions as I get into it, we'll kind of,
you can let us know. We'll provide some feedback if there's questions that came back. Mike, did you have something you wanted to kind of wrap up or say, or have a question?
Well, I was just going to add to what Roy said real quick, in that I remember doing a lot of lobbying for this project to use water quality money. And if someone had brought to me the pounds or kilograms per year that would be gained, I could have made it would have made my life a lot easier in convincing folks to spend millions of dollars of water quality money on this project.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, the different benefits and opportunities for funding that can be looked at is great. Any last questions or from folks for Roy or Evan? Well, thank you all very much for attending today. We look forward to working with you all and seeing you use the tool. And once I get the recording figured out to get posted for folks, I will let folks know. It'll be later this month sometime. So thank you all. Enjoy the day.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.